Another banner, another arcane, this time in the form of our second arcane axe. I think this is something that a lot of people have been waiting for a while, since as far as I could tell, the reception to Arcane Downfall was definitely middling at best, but it was still the best inheritable they could get at that time. Now we have a new one, and this one is a lot more specialized for the faster ones, but I wouldn't say it's the only type of unit you could use it on. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's go over the actual weapon. Arcane Prima, I think it's Thrima or Therma, it's not Prima, I can tell you that much, is a sling axe that has a global attack and defense debuff of -6. It's equivalent to Legendary Robin's debuff, to where it will always debuff a foe on the field no matter how far away they are, and it will also debuff any foe within 2 spaces of the target. It has Spectrum 5, it has the Sabotage effect, which will add additional penalties to that foe's combat as long as they are debuffed or allies within 2 spaces are debuffed. It has full tempo, and it has speed based no follow-up. Generally speaking, for all the faster units, it's going to be a massive upgrade over Arcane Downfall, which initially just had follow-up denial, healing per hit, and the breath effect. I wouldn't say it was necessarily the worst weapon by any means, but it was definitely a lot more oriented for enemy phase purposes, and some of the effects were either counterproductive to certain roles like Gale Force since it heals, or they just didn't do anything whatsoever because we're in a full no follow-up meta. Follow-up denial never really made that much of a difference. But with this weapon in particular, I would argue that it has pretty much most stuff over the original Arcane Downfall. The biggest thing is mainly just going to be whether or not you can take advantage of it with your speed stat, but I do think some archetypes don't necessarily need it. That being said, it really won't be a shock when you see the list of units that definitely want this over the other, and it's mostly comprised of units that are relatively fast. A lot of your infantries, a lot of your cavalry that have speed. However, what you'll notice is lacking in the first tier are armors and flyers, and this is mainly due to their archetype. In my opinion, the armors, regardless of speed, could take advantage of both weapons. I personally like Arcane Downfall for flyers and armors in particular, just because some of their best niches at this time are definitely a lot more enemy phase oriented. So with the healing that you get per hit and the breath effect, you could loop specials such as Pavis, Aegis, whatever the case may be, depending on the type of skills you're using. You get additional healing, which can be very beneficial for keeping sustainability up, especially for the armors. Now, I will say there are absolute benefits to taking the new Arcane over the old one, and that, in my opinion, mainly comes in the form of tempo, which is the main reason why I think any armor can run this new one. Full tempo as an effect is incredibly solid defensively, because not only are you able to negate any sort of guard effects, making it easier to special loop, but you could also nullify any sort of breath effect, and that paired with any sort of guard effect in your kit means that unless they have tempo themselves, they will never get a special off. They could always have it pre-charge or do AoEs, which is a counter to that strat for sure. At the very least, you could always prevent instant specials with Veil support, but that's only on the fundamental level that you have her to begin with. Even so, having full tempo and guard packaged into one unit is an incredibly solid defensive tool, and because of that, I do think it's worth considering for armors as well. But when it comes to the flyers, I personally think their role as a guard-bearing guidance bot is significantly stronger than giving them Arcane Prima, and that is due to having innate breath and healing per hit, which can make their sustainability and frontline prowess so much stronger. And that isn't to say they couldn't have a strong frontline presence with Thrima, because you can still do the same tech with stance and full tempo, but sustainability-wise, it's definitely going to be significantly weaker. And by no means am I saying you can't use this at all for any flyer. You could always use this for a Gale Force composition, but I don't necessarily think they're the best at that role anyway, just because their archetype in particular locks them out of a lot of gimmicks and tools that would allow them to Gale Force with much more ease. And by no means is it a deal breaker, but at this current time, I find that a lot of these flyers are much better at enemy phasing and acting as guidance bots, which is why I personally recommend Downfall over the new one, regardless of their stats. But if you did absolutely want to use the new Arcane on them, then by no means is it going to be bad. You also have all the other miscellaneous axe units that most definitely want to keep their PRF, whether it's because the PRFs that they do have are better than the Arcanes for their specific role, or that they don't necessarily benefit from running that over what they currently have at this time. And as you would expect, most of the modern stuff is on this list. Some may be questionable, some may not be, but generally speaking, I wouldn't recommend giving the new Arcane to any of these units. And there are other units that could absolutely take advantage of either of these Arcanes, but I would also recommend waiting because they are due for refines in a subsequent amount of time, and that should be due within easily 1 to 3 months. It will ultimately vary depending on how far they skip. Jill, Minerva, Rinka, and Veronica are also book 4, and there's a good chance within a given time they may end up getting a weapon that you would much rather use. But if you don't want to wait for certain units, you can definitely give the new Arcane to Jill. Minerva should be due soon, same with Rinka and Annette. Veronica, I'm pretty sure, is also ways out, but I don't think she necessarily benefits from either Arcane anyway. You could could try a Brash Assault set, but due to the fact that one is speed oriented and the other one doesn't give any sort of guaranteed follow-up, I wouldn't personally recommend it just for the sake of it. But for units you definitely want to give it to, here are some recommended skills and builds that I would absolutely recommend in a heartbeat for them. On the leftmost side, there are some build examples that you could use if trying to craft anything with this specific weapon, but on the right side, there are a helpful amount of skills that you could definitely take advantage of if none of the builds that you see are particularly something you want to run. One of the biggest perks to any infantry is that they have very good skill accessibility. They can run finish skills, flash sparrow, pledge, null see disrupt, dodge 4 skills, and so on and so forth, but there's definitely a lot of stuff you can take advantage of the weapon for. I think one of the biggest things with this weapon is that it's an incredibly solid Gale Force weapon because of the full tempo. Pair it up with any sort of skill that gives you accelerated cooldown per hit, and you should be able to charge it relatively quick, as long as the foe also doesn't have any sort of defensive tempo, which is definitely a lot more rare comparatively. Something like Flash Sparrow, Wings of Mercy, Timed Pulse, anything to get your Gale Force charging very, very easily. Or if you even want to go in with a one-tap, you could even give them Quicken Pulse, and even if they one-shot, they should be able to Gale Force on the first hit. And for the characters that just want to act as the Gale Force beacon, you can run Double Fury, Desperation, Pledge, or even other skills that allow you to get in much more quickly, even Panic Smoke, which can synergize relatively well with the sabotage effect built into it. Or if player phasing isn't something you want to do, you can definitely take advantage of Arcane Prima's full tempo effect by running Kestrel Stance 3 or any sort of respective stance skill that grants guard, any sort of dodge skill and times pulse 4, so at least you're getting a good amount of damage reduction. You don't even necessarily have to run Spurn 4, although you will only get 30% damage reduction that way. I would personally recommend trying to get some sort of passive healing wherever possible, whether that's through somebody like Saline or Gatekeeper, or if you would rather run Bulwark in your B slot, you could at least get drive damage reduction from other units such as Flame, Elamine, Veil, etc, etc. The big thing here is that you can shut off a lot of specials as long as it's not insta-charge or they have any sort of tempo effect on their own. Could also go for a staple Godlike Reflexes set. We do have that new dodge skill on Severa, so if you wanted to give that to them, they could have it insta-charge. You have Attack Speed Pledge, so you could easily loop it if you really need to. Any sort of distant counter skill, depending on which one you want to use, it could be Prime, Attack Speed Solo, whichever fits your playstyle the most, as long as it does have some ability to give you speed, so you can make Godlike Reflexes checks. It's pretty standard stuff for the most part. Or if you would rather just focus on the melee side, you could go Attack Speed Finish, Panic Smoke, and Darting Breath, just on the chance that you do potentially one-shot, which I don't think is necessarily going to happen, but you never necessarily know in a lot of situations. Attack Speed Finish, keeping your health relatively high. Buffer 4, so you get instant charge Godlike Reflexes and a good amount of DR. You get no follow-up from the weapon itself, and Panic Smoke 4 also stacks with the Sabotage. And when it comes to melee-centric matchups, I think this is probably going to be the next best thing that we do have for Axe Infantry. Next, we have the armors, and as I did previously mention, I do think you could run this on pretty much any single armor, mainly because of the benefit of having full tempo. All the slower ones won't be able to take advantage of the no follow-up effect, but you're not necessarily running it because of that anyway. But defensively, this could have a much higher ceiling just because you're shutting off so many specials in the process, especially for strategies and Aether Raids that rely on Gale Force charges. It's going to be so much more difficult for a lot of units like that, especially now that we're entering a much more player phase oriented Aether Raids meta. Although for your faster armors, you could try and stack up as much speed as possible. The sabotage effect built into the Arcane also does scale off the speed stat if it is debuffed. So for the ones that aren't necessarily as fast as the modern units, I would still argue that you could definitely make speed checks with them as long as you are able to get some sort of debuff on them. The big thing for most of these armors is that you're generally just going to be running some sort of save skill, whether that's near save or far save. And just like the other infantry build recommendation, pairing up the Arcane with any sort of effect that gives you guard is going to be incredibly useful for them in a scenario where armors are just there to eat hits, especially for units that have fire sweep effects, aka Legendary Hinoka. You could always run something like Deflect Missile, Sacred Cow, or even Aegis, so that way you can shrug off even more damage. A regular Legendary Hinoka will not be able to get Deadeye off on them as long as you have some sort of guard protection. You don't even necessarily have to run Bracing Stance or any sort of guard effect in your kit. If you have Drive Guard, which you could definitely get from something like Tanabaton or anything in the normal pool, I presume. And to make dealing with units like Hinoka much easier, you could always run Savalan Shield. That's always the tried and true tech because otherwise they just get shredded by all the armor effectiveness. And the rest of the builds are more or less just going to be variations of near save and far save builds, and you can definitely pick and choose whichever ones you want as long as they don't overlap or cancel each other out. But for those who don't really want to run the boring armor set, you could always just run near save builds with Special Fighter 4, near save, and Bonfire. This way you could instantly retaliate with specials, deal damage that way, have guard protection, get healing, and you could just be a really annoying armor to deal with, especially if you do end up running Savalan Shield, so you don't even have to worry about armor effectiveness in the end. Next, we have the melee flyers, and they're going to be doing a similar amount of stuff that you may have seen in the other builds. Not necessarily the armors because they're a lot more defensive oriented, and you would more so use down downfall for that. But for something like Gale Force, you're pretty much just going to be running the same stuff. You can run them with the intent of having them teleport in with Wings of Mercy. They won't have as much of an easy time doing one-tap Gale Force sets because not only do they lack the pulse gimmicks, but they only can run Heavy Blade. Although you could always run somebody like Gnaw or anybody that grants Visible Breath to make up for it, but that in and of itself is always just going to be an opportunity cost. If you don't care though, then go ham. You could also do a similar thing with just running Double Fury if you want to make them the Wings of Mercy beacon yourself. For the Axe Dancers in particular, mainly just Azura, you could run them with Wings of Mercy 4, and they can have the ability to not only participate in combat, but you could also refresh any ally who may just do much better in combat. You could also give them guidance if you really wanted to, so they could teleport around and search for better matchups. But if you did want to use them for Gale Force in particular, you just have to keep stacking up as much attack as possible, because the only way they're going to be self-sufficient in that regard is if they run Heavy Blade. Heavy Blade Seal, Clash, Attack Speed, Rain Snap, so you're debuffing and getting a good amount of attack buffs, and with the weapon itself having Sabotage and Innate Attack Defense global debuffs, I don't think it's actually going to be as difficult, but it is something you're going to have to watch out for regardless. But otherwise, you could also try and run some sort of enemy phase set, akin to what you would also do with the Arcane Downfall. You would run Stance, Guard Bearing, and Guidance 4. The big benefit here is that the foe won't be able to charge a special unless they have tempo themselves, but with Guard Bearing and Pavis in tow, you're going to be shrugging off a lot of damage in general, and if you are able to frontline with them, then you'll also have the benefit of allowing other allies to teleport in and do work for you as well. And in a scenario where you're also running Brave Sorin, they can then act as a near save for any ally that teleports in. Or if you did want to try something a bit more funny, you could run aerial maneuvers. They could teleport within 2 spaces of any ally within 2 spaces. You could run something like Unity and Guidance, so not only can you teleport in, then the allies that you're teleporting to could potentially leap as well. And it's just a big old game of leapfrog at that point. And lastly, we have the Axe Calves, which I think is a bit more limited comparatively to Flyers, but I do think they have a much better player phase presence, and I think it's partially due to the fact that they have much more move innately. A lot of the skills are more or less going to be the same as the ones you found on the Flyers, except you wouldn't really run something like Stance because they aren't exactly the best when it comes to enemy phasing, nor are they going to be near allies a lot of the time if you're trying to take advantage of their movement. The one thing that you may find questionable on here is Menace, because the weapon itself already debuffs, but in my opinion, it's not necessarily the worst thing you could run. Even though there is a bit of overlap with what you're debuffing, you can at the very least still debuff other stats such as speed and make speed checks much easier, on top of the fact that you also get visible buffs from it. And really the only reason you would try and run this is just that so you could get more stat swings in combat. Just keep in mind though that there is just going to be a bit of overlap, which I don't think is, again, the biggest issue, but it's something to keep in mind. Although if it's something that does bother you, you could always run other C slots such as Alarm, Panic Smoke, Savage Blow, depending on the role you go into. For Gale Forcers in particular too, you can have somebody repo a cav in, inflict another layer of sabotage on the foe because it will stack with the weapon. Go in, attack, and as long as you're able to make the attack check, which will probably happen given that you're getting 2 layers of sabotage on this kit in particular, you're going to be able to Gale Force very easily. You could also do a hit and run set with that as well. Or if you don't want to run Panic Smoke 4 and think it's a bit too much, then you could always swap it out for something like Alarm just for the extra movement after combat. And if you're also worried about your sustainability, you could go with a low cooldown special, run Surge Sparrow and just initiate combat, set up Panic Smoke, run away a bit, and then the off chance that you do have to take something in the enemy phase, if you're fast enough, you do have no follow-up built into the weapon. You won't get any stats from your A slot during that point, but Panic Smoke 4 will also make it so you don't necessarily have to worry about a big stat distribution, and you should be able to shrug off a good amount of damage with it. But of course, that isn't really the only thing you could run. You could always just run Flared Sparrow, something you could have done on the Flyers, Desperation 4, lulls, sweeps, anything of the sort that makes it so you don't necessarily have to worry about taking hits. And then to make sure that you could get away safely, you could set up Flared Sparrow Terrain and Alarm, so that way you could just run away after combat. I do think the Cavalry have a lot more benefits when it comes to player phasing, but as far as their enemy phase is concerned, it's definitely going to hinge more on the weapon because of the full no follow-up they do get, which is why I don't necessarily think it's going to be better on slower Cavalry. But if you did want to try it, then go nuts. You could stack up a crazy amount of debuffs with the Sabotage built into it. But as far as build recommendations and unit recommendations go, that is going to be about it for the video. Given that we did have to wait a good while for another Arcane Axe, I'm hopeful that this Arcane Axe will please a lot of people, and if you in particular want to pull for it, let me know who you're going to put it on in the comments below, and if you want to see more videos like this, make sure to like and subscribe, and until next time, I'll see you later.